If you're a baseball player that's been experiencing a pinchy feel each time you throw on the backside of your shoulder, then this video is for you. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Trey Martin. I'm a baseball physical therapist in the Orlando area, and today we're going to be covering a condition that is known as internal impingement. So first, let's discuss what is actually happening with internal impingement and why you're probably feeling that backside shoulder pain each time you throw a baseball or even other sports like spiking a volleyball. So what you're experiencing is, as you get into max layback position, as we're getting back here in our throw, and as we start the acceleration forward into the throw, we're getting a little bit of a pinch on the posterior side of the shoulder, so that's going to be in the infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and occasionally even into the glenoid labrum. So all these structures are going to live right back here in the shoulder, and as you get into that max layback position again, they get a little bit pinched. Now that we've covered what's actually happening, let's talk about why this is happening. So one of the things that I believe as a physical therapist is if you're always chasing just this symptom, you're never going to actually knock out the root cause of what's causing the issue. And what's actually causing this internal impingement is two main things. A, baseball players tend to get some anterior shoulder instability because you do this a ton of times. We carve out some more space on the front side of our shoulder, and then that shifts the arthrokinematics of our shoulder joint to where we have a little bit more of a closed window on the back side of the shoulder, a little too much space on the front side, and as we get into max layback, the shoulder will slam forward into the front of the glenoid, and then we're getting a little bit of a pinch in the backside because there's just not anywhere. There's no room left in the shoulder for the shoulder to go, and then we're going to get that internal impingement. B, it's going to come from a lack of a proper muscle balance. I hate the word muscle balance. It's just kind of a lame way to say it, but it's easier to understand. But by muscle balance, I mean if we don't have enough rotator cuff strength, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, like I mentioned earlier, along with teres minor, and also the scapular muscles are going to help pull us into really good layback position with good scap retraction. If we're not very strong through that line of muscle, it's going to be very hard for us to properly get into max layback and then project the arm forward into early acceleration and to throw the ball hard. So what's going to happen is we're going to have to get the force from somewhere. So as we rock back into max layback, that shoulder is getting pinched and then flying forward. So diving in a little bit further, we'll commonly see with throwers, we've got a lot of big guys on the front side of the shoulder here. They're going to help pull you down here and get this scap tilted forward position. If we're looking like pec minor, pec major, subscap, lat, all of these guys are very, very strong, and teres major even, they can pull you forward, and then as you get back in that max layback position, there's nowhere else for the shoulder joint to go. So problem A, anterior glenohumeral instability, front side of the shoulders loose from years of throwing, and then B, it's just that muscular relationship. So what can we do about that? I'm going to help take you through like a little bit of a case scenario. This is a guy that I've been working with. He's a high school pitcher that's been up in the low 90s, that's been dealing with internal impingement for 6 months now. We started working together about a month ago, and I'm going to give you guys a snapshot in one of my sessions. We're going to kind of break down why I'm doing what I'm doing and how that's going to help with the problem at hand. So for any rehab process, first we have to start with the examination and evaluation piece. I realize this is a YouTube video. I'm not your physical therapist, so I'm not going to go too much into the details, but I will say that with any condition, internal impingement, rotator cuff injuries, labral tears, elbow issues, etc., if you don't examine the low-hanging fruit and what that specific athlete needs, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to preface with that because I don't want you guys to take this and be like, okay, I'm going to go do these treatment steps immediately. You don't even know if that's necessarily what you need, but let's just start with a little bit of rationale. So if we're, again, going back to internal impingement, if we're viewing it as the soft tissue on the front side is relatively tightened typically, we see a little bit of that forward tilt position. So if someone's like laying flat on their back on a treatment table, we'll see a little bit of a rock forward. We'll see generally a pretty hypertonic pec minor, pec major, subscap, lat. Generally will be a little bit stiffer. If we see that rolled down, we're going to have a harder time getting into max layback. So I'm going to want to start by assessing that. What does my soft tissue quality look like? What's my active range of motion? What's my passive range of motion looking like? So I know it's probably not super helpful if you're not a PT, so you're probably reading this like, hey, just give me the answer. What do I need to do for this condition? But I want you guys to think about that first. Like, you need to think about addressing what you need addressed the most, because not everyone needs the same thing. So with Skylar specifically, we evaluated soft tissue. We took a bunch of range of motions. I wish I had that on video for you guys. In day one, I mean, just taking his arm passively into just overhead flexion. I mean, we were getting to like 90 degrees before it was starting to be painful. Normal's 180, and then also taking him back into like shoulder external rotation. Normally, now that he's feeling better, he's up to like 145, 150, and that's a pretty typical passive range of motion. I think the first day we were at 110. So point being, if you don't restore the soft tissue, restore normal range of motion, if you just go start loading the scap and rotator cuff, you're going to be chasing down the wrong path because you're not going to fix that relationship where we're having a little bit of a happier muscle balance. Again, hate that term, but you know what I mean. So with Skylar, that's what we found in the first place, was that we had to start by just working on passive range of motion. We did a little bit of dry needling just to like calm down the symptoms. I wanted to get him out of pain and back to a normal baseline of range of motion where his IR plus ER here was pretty equivalent to here plus here. So once we got his arc kind of in a pretty good spot, then we started looking a little bit further into the piece of like, okay, what muscle groups are weaker and at what area? So I use this thing called a handheld dynamometer. It's basically a fancy force meter, and it'll say like, you push into it and it'll say, hey, that was 35 pounds, or 35 newtons of force. Ooh, I need to look into that. I don't know if dynamometers are pounds or newtons. If you know that, put that in the comments. I should probably look. Mine just gives me a number. It's a Lafayette dynamometer. So anyway, so if I have him push out there and he's 35 and he's 35 this way, what we saw with him was that when we got him into like more of an overhead position, all strength just, because once we got him towards layback, that little impingement approximation piece happened, strength goes away. So what that tells me is once I've corrected his general like range of motion actively and passively, I'm going to need to spend a little extra time re-strengthening these overhead positions, which makes sense for a thrower. I mean, that's where most of the issues are happening. But I say that because a lot of times I'll see guys that like, you get tested at a doc and he's just like, hey, push in, push out. And, oh, you're fine. And we're not really looking at the actual position that they're throwing in. So that's an important piece. So with Skylar, that's what we found. We found we needed range of motion first with some soft tissue work, a little bit of dry needling, and then fast forward to today's session, now that we're pain-free and getting closer to throwing, what I like to do with these guys is I like to make sure that we're maintaining mobility first, so I'll have them do some simple stuff like laying on a foam roller and just letting like pecs stretch out a little bit, getting some T-spine extension, working on rotation. Remember, it's a little bit more free range of motion at the shoulder joint, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're able to get into great layback, right? So yes, the joint has plenty of range, but the soft tissue and surrounding structure is keeping it here. Like imagine if I was pulling on your shirt like this and asking you to get into max layback, you can't. If I let it go, boom, there's a bunch of extra degrees there. So that's how we address his sessions now, is we first attack range of motion, then we're going to start doing some things like loading the scaps. He's at a pretty advanced stage now, so like the reverse sled drag I'm showing, or the elevated pike push-ups, I mean, he's past some of the beginning stages. That's not necessarily where we start. You could start with something more gentle, like a T and a Y off an incline bench, scap wall slides. You could even do some just like static, like bear position, bear taps, unweighted bear crawls, things like that. So that's kind of our general first thought, right? Range of motion first. Then I like going through just some simple like scap ability type stuff where we're just getting a little bit of load that's not super, super intensive. And then from there, we're going to really start building into like more explosive patterns, like explosive landmine presses, and even doing some like hanging work like scap pull-ups, regular pull-ups, chin-ups, those kind of things, just to kind of help improve that upward rotation, the upward movement pattern, also with a little bit of load. And the other thing too that I will mention that's also low-hanging fruit that most people don't think about, you have to evaluate these athletes from the entire kinetic chain. So when I looked at Skylar the first day, like his hip internal rotation, like if I took his hip and turned him this way in internal rotation, we had like 10 degrees on the right side. So if you just completely ignore lower half, completely, like you ignore thoracic rotation, you ignore hip internal, external rotation, what you might see is you fix the shoulder and then it comes right back because the symptomology was happening from them not being able to actually like get into their back leg, rotate, get good hip to shoulder separation, and then it causes some timing issues up the chain where then they get a little bit late, they try to catch up last second, and then that's where their internal impingement kind of catches up. So that's just more of an advanced thought, but point being, I'll tend to add in a little bit more each session than just, hey, let me just do is like rotator cuff work or some soft tissue. We'll generally start range of motion, build a little bit of scap, do some hands-on manuals for the rotator cuff specifically, some hanging work, some overhead with load like landmine, pike press, that type of thing, overhead carries, and then we'll also look at the low-hanging fruit from lower body perspective, whether it's ankle mobility, hip mobility, hip to shoulder separation, T-spine rotation, T-spine extension, scap posterior tilt, things like that. I think those can make a world of difference, and that's why I'm really, really thankful to be in a one-on-one setting and as a PT, because then you can kind of look a little bit more detailed. So just to sum up here, I'm going to put in some anatomy and some different videos so you guys can kind of get the example along the way here. But point being, internal impingement, what we have is a little bit too much laxity on the front side of the shoulder generally, a little bit too much tension through the front side soft tissues like pec minor, pec major, teres, teres major, and lat, and those can pull us into a disadvantageous position to where the shoulder has no room to go as we rock in a max layback. The rotator cuff, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and sometimes even the glenoid labrum take the brunt of that. They get a little pinch, you get a little pain on the backside, then it hurts in max layback. And then the process of getting it back better, we have to correct the soft tissue, rebalance the range of motion at the shoulder joint. So this plus this is equivalent to this plus this. Then we want our strength to be pretty much the same in all positions, including overhead positions like a 90-90 into external rotation and internal rotation. We're going to work scapular movements. We're going to work hanging movements. And then we're not going to neglect the athlete as a whole. We're going to look at the entire kinetic chain, maybe clean up some things like hip rotation, T-spine rotation, and that type of stuff. So that's kind of the PT view of things. Last but not least, we'll talk about the throwing workload type of thing too. Generally, if I can get in touch with their pitching coach or whoever's kind of running the throwing program, I will, because that's a huge part of this. So you can do all the things right in PT world and they're completely healed, stronger, feeling great. And then if they just go right back into sport and they don't have a good interval throwing program, it's all for naught. So I would say best advice, get linked up with someone that kind of knows what they're doing on that standpoint. And then simplest advice, start with something slow that's tolerable. Maybe it even looks like if it's been 4 months since you've been able to throw, maybe the first day out you're going out to 60 feet with 50% intensity, a little bit of an arc, and you're just checking in to see, like, did I get symptoms back the next day? Because if you just go out and start just blasting it again, it's probably going to come back. You're going to have to build up slowly and methodically, because even the best PT in the world can help you optimize your layback. Nothing stresses layback as much as throwing. None of the stuff at the gym is really going to get you exactly to that level of stress. It's going to be close. If I'm doing my job, it should be pretty similar, but it's never going to be quite the same as trying to huck a ball 90 miles per hour. So yeah, in that return to throw phase, I can't emphasize that enough. Like, take it slow. Don't be going and adding 50% volume or 50% intensity week over week. You know, something small. Like if you're 30 throws from 60 feet with 50% intensity, maybe the next week you add each variable, 10, 15%. Maybe you go 35 throws at 55, 60%, 60 feet again. Something like that at a slow, steady pace. Take your time on the return to throw. Make sure that, normal throwing feels good before you get into maybe your long toss program. And once that feels good, then feel out a flat ground. If the flat ground's good, try a bullpen. If the bullpen's good, game. You kind of get the progression there. Well, anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in. If you've had internal impingement or you're having some posterior side shoulder pain, I'd love to help you out. So either drop a comment below or you can reach me on Instagram at athlete.rehab. Just drop in for the question. I work with a lot of guys online too. So if you need help with kind of building out a program or a protocol, for sure hit me up and I'd love to help you out with this.